students put into our lives, things that we learned here tonight, and help make us a better Christian. Please be with us as we travel home. Help keep us safe. In Christ's name we pray.
Thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I realize now that I don't have my mic on. I just learned a little while ago that we got a birthday boy in the house. And I don't think he's aware of the fact that whoever has a birthday on Wednesday night when I'm teaching the class, that fellow has to teach the class. Somebody said, let's sing happy birthday. All right, Alan, you ready? How old are you, Alan? You're what?
He's closer to 30 than 20.
Let me turn this back off. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Alan. Happy birthday to you. How about that? Congratulations. Congratulations. You may have started a routine now that we'll have to do again. We're glad all of you were able to make it safe and soundly. I'll tell you what, I'm going to be a little bit warm, so I'm going to come out of this jacket. Matthew 24, excuse me, is where we're starting, where we'll be studying tonight. As I said last week, this is a very, very important chapter. It is a passage from God's Word that is often abused. People go to it for wrong reasons. They misapply it, make a misapplication of it. In reference to the end of time, the premillennial theory sometimes draws from this chapter bits and pieces. But always remember that the Bible is its own best interpreter, and you have to approach the interpreting of Scripture from a logical and consistent standpoint. You have to take into consideration the different types of languages in the Scriptures. There is highly figurative language. There's what we call apocalyptic language, which has to do with tremendous events occurring, but in a symbolic way, like the heavenly bodies falling and moon turning to blood, things like that, sometimes was used to describe the fall of powerful empires and rulers. And it talks about cataclysmic things happening, you know. And some of that language you may find in this chapter, but there's a couple of passages that I want to note in particular. We have emphasized the importance of the statements like those days, in those days. Notice the description of that period of time. It's a time period that consists of days. And then you will find passages that say that day, singular. It'll be a singular rendering of the word. And so you're talking about a one-time thing. It's not going to be stretched out over a vast period of days, but there's going to be something that happens, and even the word hour is used sometimes. So that helps us to delineate between the events, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the second coming of Christ. Those are the two things, the two primary things that are being discussed in this chapter. We talked about where the eagles were gathered in verse 28 last time. But as you begin reading in verse 29, you'll notice immediately after the tribulation. Now we've just learned that the tribulation that he is talking about was the desolation that Daniel had talked about in his book. And so this is a continuation of that. After the tribulation of those days, there's that statement again, those days, shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Now, I mentioned last time that some believe that this is apocalyptic literature referring to the fall of the Jewish state. There are other commentators who believe that Jesus here inserts a reference to his second coming to make the distinction between the fall of Jerusalem and his second coming. That the fall of Jerusalem is going to have all these signs and so on and all of that. But his second coming is going to be a grand event that will be observed by all, the gathering together of the elect and all of that. So I'm not going to be dogmatic about it one way or the other, but it seems to me that this is still a discussion of the general theme of the destruction of Jerusalem, because the break that is very dramatic occurs in verse 36, where Jesus says, but of that day and hour knows no man. That seems to me to be the natural break between the two sections, because as you look at verse 32 beginning, he said, now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. That is, here is an indication that there were signs that would reveal that the destruction of Jerusalem was near at hand. That it would be in the immediate future. It would be 40 years, but that's a relative time frame, really. I mean, what's 40 years? I mean, that seems like an eternity when you're a kid. But I can tell you personally, 40 years is not a very long time. It passes pretty quickly. You turn around a few times and 40 years is gone. Every year gets shorter. That's true, Jim. That's very true. My dear grandmother used to say that, and I thought she was just a fuddy-duddy, because she'd say, oh, children, Christmas will be here before you know it. It's just around the corner. And I was thinking all the time, it's never going to come. Never going to come. But she told us many times just what Miss Dimple said. She said, the older you get, the shorter the years are. Let's think about it. Christmas just passed, didn't it? And it's already February. Carmack Bradley's birthday's already taken place. He's born on Groundhog's Day, those of you. I think I remember that correctly. Now, notice this. When you see a fig tree putting forth leaves, you know that summer is near. See, that gives you an indication. Anybody seen any buttercups yet? I believe R.W. said he had. Yeah, there's several of you that have seen some. So you know that, there'll be some more cool weather, but spring is going to be here before you know it. That's what that tells us. So likewise he's talking to his disciples. So likewise when you shall see all these things, there's that statement again. All these things. What things? These signs. Signs about what? Signs about the destruction of Jerusalem. Know that it is near, even at the doors. Now, he had told them, you're going to see the armies gathering around the city of Jerusalem. When you see that, you better know what's coming. And we saw a passage last week where he said, if you're in Judea, that's in verse 16, let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Well, Judea was a mountainous area. Mount Moriah was where the temple was, and believed to be the place where Abraham offered Isaac, and several other very important biblical events happened there. So you have that location in mind. It's going to happen in Judea. You that are in Judea, flee into the mountains. Get away. Get out of the city. Now, he goes on to say in verse 34, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. I want you to notice two things. This generation, now that denotes, if I remember correctly from what I've read from the Greek scholars and so on, say that there are different words that are used in different places to denote the passing of time or to distinguish a particular period of time, but that the word that is used here denotes this present generation. Not a generation to come, not a generation that is past, but this present generation is going to see these things that I've been talking about. And notice that he says, this generation shall not pass till all these things shall be fulfilled, or be fulfilled. Word shall is not in the King James. Till all these things be fulfilled. What things? The signs that he's told them about. And then
You're saying then that verses 29 through 31 is not talking about the end of time.
no, I don't think so. Well, we know this statement is not, but as I said, that section 29 through 31 is discussed back and forth sometimes. Some people think that there is a reference here to the second coming of Christ, to point out that it is going to be visible to all, happen suddenly, be universal, be unequal in its glory and all that, while others think that this is a symbolic or figurative coming of the Lord that describes the destruction of Jerusalem. So, like I said, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it one way or the other, but we do know that in verse 32 there is a little bit of a shift, because he says, now learn a parable of the fig tree. So he might be coming back to the destruction of Jerusalem. But he uses the fig tree parable to illustrate that there will be signs that can be seen. Now, we'll learn in reference to the second coming of Christ that there's not going to be any signs because of the nature of it and the way it's described. And then he said, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. That is, this is going to happen. This will happen. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And they would come to realize that what Jesus had told them in these verses, many of them would live to experience it and to see those things. Their children would anyway, And some of those living then would probably live to see the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 36 begins, but of that day and hour knows no man. Now you see clearly there a change in emphasis. We've been talking about these days, these things, other similar statements, but now he says, first of all, the verse is introduced with the word but that denotes what? Usually a contrast. Denotes there's something else that we want to talk about now, and we want to show you the difference between those days and this day. But of that day and hour knows no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. One of the other accounts adds in this particular passage, not the Son. The Son doesn't know. Jesus was talking about himself. But here he says, but my Father only. And that would imply that Jesus didn't know when he would come the second time. Now, as long as I can remember, I've heard preachers say this, and I think it's a good observation to make. Whether the Father has revealed to the Son since his return to heaven when he's going to come, we don't know. And we don't need to know. Because Jesus emphasizes in this context what we need to concentrate on. And let's see if we can find out what it is. But of that day and hour knows no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Now, he mentions the angels. They're going to be involved in the second coming, we know from numerous other passages. But they hadn't been informed either. They will do the bidding of God, and they will accompany the Lord when he returns. Several passages remind us of that. But they're not the ones that make the decision about that. So let's see what he says. In verse 37, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now that reminds us of a story that we've all known from time we can remember. Noah and the flood. I remember studying that when I was a small boy in Bible classes and hearing it read and discussed in sermons when I was very young. So he uses an Old Testament story that was very familiar to his disciples and to all the Jews in that day. And I remember somebody not too long ago referring to Noah's story and the ark story and so on as a myth. You know, it was just a myth. But there's a lot of evidence that it is accurate, and if you believe the Bible, the matter's settled. But you'll notice that in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking. That is, they were carrying on the routines of everyday life. Now, sometimes eating and drinking refers to excesses or a vice. That doesn't seem to be the case here. It seems to just be talking about things that people normally do. They were eating and drinking. They were marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark. That is, life was going on as usual. The Bible doesn't tell us that anybody made fun of Noah, per se, but we can pretty well determine that, or know, and it Might be speculation, but we know human nature, don't we? What are you building, Noah? I'm building an ark. What's an ark? It's a big boat. What do you need a big boat for? Think it's going to rain? Think it's going to come a flood? You know, you can imagine how people are about things like that. I remember a man in Jackson County who had the reputation of being a big liar. He came down the road one morning down Morrison's Creek, I'm told, and one of the fellows said, his name wasn't Joe, but I'll call him Joe. Joe, tell us a big one this morning. He never did slow his horse down. He said, no, got to get down to Miss So-and-so's. I heard that she is really, really sick this morning. Just kept riding. Well, that family got everything ready, and they went down to see Mrs. So-and-so. And they got down there, and she was just fine. Old Joe told them a lie and made them believe it, and held up his reputation, you know. But just goes to show you that what can happen. The next verse talks about that they knew not until the flood came. What did they not know? That a flood was coming.
The end was coming.
Yeah, the end was coming. That's right. He's talking about the end of time here. So they didn't.
But they didn't believe, they probably knew that it had been taught to them, but they didn't believe it.
That's probably true. Noah was a preacher of righteousness, wasn't he? Peter tells us that. He was a preacher of righteousness, and while the ark was preparing, he was preparing the ark, he was a itinerant preacher, I guess you could say. And for 120 years, he no doubt shared information about the coming flood, but nobody but his family believed it. And I know of some folks that wonder maybe if his own family really believed him. Well, it seems to me that they did. They went into the ark with him, and I doubt that he had to drive them in. But Noah was successful in saving his family. But nobody else paid much attention to him. Now he said, that's the way it's going to be when Jesus, or when I come again. He's talking about his second coming. It's going to be, there's going to be no advance warning, you know, no signs that you can read. If you just, you know, if you don't believe the Lord when he says he's coming, then you're not going to be ready. Now, the passage that I'm about to read is the one that sometimes premillennialists try to take and apply them to the so-called rapture theory. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Now, there are people who say, see there? That's the rapture. And people are going to be raptured out while others are going to be left. How many of you remember the books that were written by, his name was on the tip of my tongue when I started to tell it, several years ago. He wrote a series of books, and a lot of them ended up being movies, I think. But the theory was that one of these days, people will be watching the Tonight Show. And he said all of a sudden there will be someone who will just disappear off the set. And the others will be left there. And that person who disappears will have been raptured out. How many of you ever saw the bumper sticker that said, in case of the rapture, this car will be abandoned? See Janice and some of you shaking your heads. I've seen that bumper sticker. Now, can you imagine the chaos and confusion that would take place if things like that were to happen? I meant to mention at the outset, here's a principle of biblical interpretation, that any text taken out of context becomes a pretext. That simply means that there's no way you can arrive at the truth about a matter if you just pull a passage out here and a passage out there. The idea here is, Jesus is talking about being saved and not being saved. How do we know that? He's just finished the illustration of the flood. How many classes of people were involved in the flood? Two people. Two classes of people. You had 8 souls that were saved, Peter said, by water. Everybody else was lost. Noah and his family were saved while the others were what? Left. They were left. That's what he's talking about here. One shall be taken, the other shall be left. I believe that the premillennialists sometimes will talk about left behind. Don't be left behind. Well, it's true that we should not want to be the one left behind, lost. But they're saying that those left behind are going to suffer great tribulation for a period of time. And then Jesus is going to come back again. And some say that none of the saints will suffer tribulation, while others, premillennialists, say that there will be those who are saved that go through a tribulation period. There's all kinds of different millennialists out there. But you can't pull this passage out of its context. And people, I've told you a story about Charles White doing the article in the paper, and people would write him questions, you know. And he had a block ad there where he'd write an article each week. Somebody wrote and asked him the question, what does the Bible say about the rapture? So he wrote the question up here, what does the Bible say about the rapture? And his article that week had one word: nothing. He said, Edward, I just put nothing, exclamation point. And just ran it just like that. He said, you talk about getting some responses. We got some responses that week. And he had some good Bible studies to come out of that. But the Bible really doesn't say anything about the rapture. Certainly not anything nearly akin to what our premillennial friends sometimes teach. Now, notice the emphasis that he makes in verse 42. He says, watch therefore. The Greek word that is translated watch in that passage could be translated, and I think it is in some translations, be on the alert. Be on the alert. Always be alert. You know, be alert, arrive unhurt. We've seen that little slogan out on the road. Watch therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord doth come. You don't know when he's coming. Go back to John 5:28 and 29, where Jesus said, marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, in the which, now listen to this, all that are in the graves shall hear his voice and come forth. Well, now maybe, preacher, that still doesn't mean everybody. He goes on to say, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life. Now there's the righteous. They that have done evil unto the resurrection of condemnation. There's your two classes. The two classes of people. Noah's day, there were the prepared and the unprepared. Jesus said it's going to be the same way when I come again. There will be those who are prepared. There will be those who are unprepared. And they're all going to be raised at the same time. It's going to be the same hour. And notice how many times that Jesus uses the word day and the word hour in connection with his second coming. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known and watched the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. He is saying the same thing that is said in many other passages. The day of the Lord will come as a what? Thief in the night. It's interesting to notice that that word broken up in verse 43 literally means to dig through. Most of the houses in that day were made of kind of plaster, mud-like. And a thief would usually just dig a hole through the wall and crawl through. That's how he got into the house. Jesus said, now, that the man that's over the house, if he knew what hour the thief was coming, he'd be waiting for him. Therefore be you also ready, for in such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man comes. Remember Peter talking about the second coming of Christ? And he said that people would say, why? Things continue as they have from the creation. Life's going to go on. You know, this whole world's going to stand here forever. It'll be here forever. Jesus is not coming, is what the idea is. But Jesus warns us. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord hath made ruler over his household to give them meat in due season? And he goes on to point out, it's that servant who is faithful. And that's what we must do in order to be prepared for the Lord's coming. Blessed is that servant, whom the Lord, or whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find so doing. That's our task, isn't it? To be faithful. It's not, we don't have to worry about when is Jesus going to come. We know that he's going to. Our task is to make preparation for that coming and stay in a state of preparation. Some of you in here remember, as I do, when the Cold War was going on, and there were a lot of people right through this area that built shelters into which they would be able to enter and live for a period of time if we had a nuclear war. You had to build the entrance just so. My daddy helped a few people build just such shelters. You had to fix the entrance where you had to turn corners so that the radiation couldn't get through there. You had to everything, you had to have your food supply ready. There were a lot of people that were very, very serious about that. Well, that may be a signal for me to end, because I think that's a storm warning, isn't it? Flash flood warning. Well, we know that the earth's not going to be destroyed with water, but we do all need to be diligent tonight going home and to be careful. Thank you for your being here.